For thousands of years, the world has called Perseus a hero, a slayer of monsters, a legend. But what if that story was wrong? Because the creature he killed, Medusa, wasn't always a monster. She was once human, and what happened to her wasn't her choice. So when Perseus finally found her, this wasn't a fair fight. He didn't face her. He didn't look her in the eyes. With help from the gods, he struck from a distance and ended her life in a single moment. And just like that, he became a hero. But if the victim was never the monster, then what does that make the man who killed her? Tonight, we're not retelling a myth. We're uncovering the truth. You've probably heard this story before. A brave hero sets out on an impossible quest, defeats a terrifying monster, and comes back victorious. That hero is Perseus. And the monster? Medusa. Simple, right? Hero kills monster. End of story. That's the version most of us grew up with. Clean, easy, comfortable. But here's the problem. That version leaves out almost everything that actually matters. And once you start looking closer, the story doesn't feel heroic anymore. It feels unsettling, because Perseus wasn't just some random hero chasing glory. He was sent on this mission. Forced into it, actually. A king named Poseidon wanted him gone, so he gave him a task that sounded impossible. Bring me the head of Medusa. Not defeat her. Not stop her. Kill her. And bring back proof. Right there, the story already shifts. This isn't a heroic journey born from courage. It's a setup. A death sentence disguised as a quest. And somehow we still call what comes next a heroic act. Now let's talk about Medusa, because everything depends on how you see her. If she's just a monster, then sure, Perseus is the hero. But what if she wasn't? What if the creature everyone feared used to be someone completely different? Some versions of the myth say Medusa was once a beautiful woman. Not just beautiful, devoted. A priestess serving Athena, bound by vows, living a life of discipline and purity. That's a very different starting point, isn't it? Not a monster hiding in a cave, but a human being with a life, a role, and a future. And then something happens. Something that most retellings rush through or avoid completely. Medusa is violated inside Athena's temple, not by a mortal, but by a god. Poseidon, let that sink in for a second. A god commits the act inside a sacred place, and yet he faces no real punishment. Instead, the one who is punished is Medusa. Athena, enraged not at Poseidon, but at the desecration of her temple, turns Medusa into something unrecognizable. Her hair becomes snakes. Her gaze becomes a curse. Anyone who looks at her turns to stone. Just like that, a victim becomes a monster. And here's the first shocking truth most people never question. Medusa didn't choose to become a monster. She was turned into one. That changes everything. Because now, when you picture Perseus walking into that cave, he's not hunting a creature born evil. He's hunting someone who was transformed into something terrifying against her will. But Perseus doesn't go in alone. Not even close. This is where the heroic image starts to crack. He gets help, divine help. Athena gives him a reflective shield so he doesn't have to look at Medusa directly. Hermes gives him a blade. Other gifts follow: tools, weapons, guidance, everything he needs to make sure he wins. And suddenly, this isn't a story about bravery anymore. It's a story about advantage, strategy, and overwhelming power against a single target who never asked to be part of this. Think about that for a moment. Perseus never has to face Medusa eye to eye. He never risks turning to stone. He watches her through a reflection, like a hunter watching prey from a safe distance. And when the moment comes, he strikes. One clean move. No warning, no conversation, no hesitation. Just like that, she's gone. And here's the second shocking truth. Medusa never even sees him coming. There's no dramatic battle, no clash, no final stand. The fight that defines Perseus as a hero isn't really a fight at all, comma. After that, the story does something even stranger. Perseus takes her head, not to honor the victory, but to use it as a weapon. He shows it to enemies, turning them into stone, over and over again. The same curse that made Medusa a monster becomes his greatest tool, and nobody questions it. Nobody calls it cruel. Instead, it's seen as clever, powerful, heroic. So let's pause here, because this is where everything starts to feel off. A woman is transformed into a monster after being wronged. A man is sent to kill her for someone else's benefit. He uses divine tools to avoid any real danger. He kills her without a direct confrontation, and then uses her severed head as a weapon. And somehow, he's the hero. That's the version of the story we inherited, the one repeated for centuries. But once you lay it all out like this, it stops feeling like a simple tale of good versus evil. It starts to feel like something else entirely. Because if the monster was once a victim, and the hero never actually faced her fairly, then maybe the story isn't about a hero at all. Maybe it's about how easily we accept a narrative, as long as it's been told the same way for long enough. And this is just the beginning, because the deeper we go into this story, the harder it becomes to tell who the real monster is. All right, let's keep going, because this is where the story starts getting even more uncomfortable the deeper you look at it. Up to this point, most people are still willing to defend Perseus. They'll say, well, Medusa was dangerous. People turn to stone just by looking at her. And yeah, that's true. But here's the part that almost nobody stops to think about. Why was she dangerous in the first place? Was she hunting people? Was she chasing victims across the land? Or was she isolated, hidden away, avoided by the world that feared her? Because when you really picture it, Medusa isn't some wandering villain causing chaos. She's in a cave, far away, removed, almost like she's been pushed out of the world. And that raises a very uncomfortable question. If she's not actively threatening society, then why was killing her so important? Who exactly was she a danger to? And suddenly the mission doesn't feel like saving the world anymore. It feels like eliminating something that makes people uncomfortable. Now let's zoom in on Perseus again, because his story isn't as clean as it sounds either. He didn't grow up dreaming of slaying monsters. He wasn't training his whole life for this moment. In fact, his life starts with fear and survival. His mother, Dano, was locked away because a prophecy said her son would one day kill her father. And when Perseus was born, instead of being celebrated, he was thrown into the sea in a chest with his mother. Think about that for a second. Before he ever becomes a hero, he's already a victim of someone else's fear. He survives, He grows up, and for a while things are quiet. But then another man in power, King Polydex, enters the picture. And this is where things start to feel familiar. Again, power, control, manipulation. Polydex wants Perseus out of the way, so he gives him an impossible task. Not because it's noble, but because it's convenient. And here comes the third shocking truth. Perseus didn't choose this mission out of heroism. He was pushed into it by someone who wanted him gone. And yet, despite all that, this is the part where people usually say, well, at least he was brave, but was he? Or was he just equipped really, really well? Because let's be honest, the version of Perseus we're told is almost unstoppable. He gets tools specifically designed to remove every real risk. A mirrored shield so he never has to face Medusa directly. A weapon strong enough to kill her instantly. Guidance from the gods themselves. This isn't a fair fight, it's controlled, planned, almost guaranteed. And here's something that might change how you see it forever. If you remove all the divine help, would Perseus still win? Or would the story end very differently? Because bravery usually means facing danger, not eliminating it before it even becomes real. And in this story, danger is carefully removed piece by piece until there's almost nothing left for Perseus to risk. Now picture the moment again. The cave is quiet. Medusa is there, not attacking, not chasing, just existing in the only place she has left. Perseus approaches, but he doesn't look at her. He can't. He watches her through reflection. That alone tells you everything about the situation. There's no connection, no confrontation, just distance. And then it happens. One strike, fast, clean, final. No last words. No understanding. No acknowledgement of who she used to be. And here's the part that hits the hardest when you really think about it. Medusa dies without ever seeing the person who killed her. There's something deeply unsettling about that. Not just because of how it happened, but because of how easily the story moves on afterward, like none of that matters. And maybe that's the most disturbing part of all. Not the violence, not the transformation, but how quickly everything is simplified into hero wins, monster loses, because once that label is applied, nobody questions it anymore. Nobody asks who Medusa was before. Nobody asks whether Perseus had a choice. Nobody asks why the gods helped him, or why they didn't help her. The story becomes clean again, comfortable again. But underneath that simplicity is something much more complicated. A victim turned into a symbol of fear. A man turned into a hero for completing a task he didn't even choose. And a world that accepts it all without hesitation. So now I want you to really sit with this, not as a myth, but as a pattern. Because when we hear stories like this, we don't just learn about the past, we learn how narratives are built. Who gets called a hero? Who gets labeled a monster? And how easily those roles can be reversed, depending on who's telling the story. All right, now let's rewind a bit, because if we really want to understand how this all happened, we need to go back before the hero versus monster narrative was even created. Before Perseus ever picked up a weapon, before anyone even said the name Medusa, there was already a chain of decisions being made by people in power. And this is where things start to feel less like a legend and more like a setup, because Perseus didn't wake up one day and decide, I'm going to hunt a monster. No, his life was already shaped by fear, prophecy and control. His grandfather, Acrisius, heard a prophecy that he would be killed by his own grandson, and instead of accepting fate, he tried to escape it. He locked his daughter Dino away, isolated her, controlled her life completely. But here's the thing about Greek myths: they always remind you that no matter how hard you try to control destiny, it finds a way in, and in this case it came in the form of Zeus. Now this part is often told like something magical, almost romantic. Zeus descending in a golden shower, visiting Danae, and Perseus being born from that moment. But if you strip away the poetic language, it becomes a lot more uncomfortable, because Danae didn't have a choice. She was locked away, completely vulnerable. And once again, just like with Medusa later on, a powerful god enters the story, takes what he wants, and leaves the consequences behind for others to deal with. And here's your first shocking truth for this chapter. The great hero, Perseus, is born from an act that wasn't about love or destiny, but about power and lack of choice. And yet, the story doesn't frame it that way. It presents it as something divine, something important, something necessary. But when you really look at it, it follows the exact same pattern we've already seen. And when Acrisius finds out about the child, does he accept it? Of course not. He panics, because now the prophecy feels real. And instead of confronting it, he does something that sets the tone for Perseus's entire life. He puts Danae and baby Perseus into a wooden chest and throws them into the sea. Just imagine that for a second. A mother and her newborn child, sealed inside a box, drifting into open water, no control, no direction, just hoping they survive. And somehow we're still supposed to believe this story is about heroism later on. Because here's the second shocking truth. Before Perseus was ever called a hero, he was a victim of someone else's fear. His entire life begins with someone trying to get rid of him. They survive, of course, because stories like this always let the main character live. The chest washes ashore on an island, and they're taken in by a fisherman named Dictys. For a while, things are calm, quiet, almost normal. Perseus grows up, learns how to live, learns how to survive, and if the story ended here, maybe things would have been different. Maybe he would have just lived a simple life. But Greek mythology doesn't really allow for peaceful endings, does it? Because eventually, power shows up again, this time in the form of King Polydex, the ruler of the island. And just like every powerful figure we've seen so far, he wants something. Not glory, not justice. He wants Danae, and this is where the story starts to mirror itself in a way that's honestly hard to ignore. Because once again, a woman becomes the target of someone in power. And once again, the solution isn't about protecting her. It's about removing the obstacle. In this case, that obstacle is Perseus. Polydex knows he can't just get rid of him openly, so he creates a plan, a public challenge. He pretends he's collecting wedding gifts and asks each man to bring something impressive. When Perseus, trying to prove himself, says he can bring anything, even the head of Medusa, Polydex immediately locks onto it. And here comes the third shocking truth. Perseus basically volunteers for his own death mission, because he's manipulated into proving his worth. It's not courage in the pure sense. It's pressure, pride, a need to stand up in a room where power is already against him, and just like that, the stage is set. Not for a heroic quest born from noble intention, but for a mission built on manipulation, fear, and control. Perseus isn't leaving to save the world. He's leaving because a king wants him gone, because a system of power has decided his role. And the craziest part? The story still frames this as the beginning of a hero's journey. But if you really look at it, it's the beginning of something much darker. Because from this point on, every step Perseus takes is influenced by forces bigger than him gods, kings, expectations, and every choice he makes is shaped by a situation he didn't fully create. So before we even get to Medusa, before the monster enters the picture, we already have to ask ourselves something uncomfortable. Was Perseus ever truly free to choose who he wanted to be? Or was he just playing the role that the world forced onto him? Now here's where the story quietly shifts from a dangerous mission into something much more calculated. Because once Perseus accepts the task, something unexpected happens. He doesn't struggle to prepare. He doesn't wander aimlessly trying to figure things out. Instead, help arrives almost immediately. And not just any help. Divine help. Guidance from beings far more powerful than him. And at first, it sounds like a blessing, right? Like fate is on his side. But if you slow down and really think about it, this is where things get a little uncomfortable again. Because the question isn't, why is Perseus being helped? The real question is, why is Medusa not? If this is truly a battle between good and evil, between hero and monster, then why does only one side get support from the gods? Why is one side equipped with tools, knowledge, and protection, while the other is left isolated, unchanged, and completely alone? And just like that, the idea of a fair fight starts to disappear. So Perseus begins his journey, and one of the first challenges he faces isn't Medusa herself, it's finding her, because Medusa isn't easy to locate. She's hidden far away, almost like the world has intentionally placed her out of reach. And to get to her, Perseus has to seek out strange, mysterious beings known as the three sisters who share one eye and one tooth between them. It sounds bizarre, almost surreal, but this moment is more important than it seems, because Perseus doesn't win them over with kindness or persuasion. He tricks them. He steals their shared eye while they're passing it between each other, forcing them to give him the information he needs. And here's your first shocking truth for this chapter. The hero doesn't earn his path forward. He takes advantage of others' weaknesses to get what he wants. Again, it's clever, strategic, but is it heroic? Or is it just another example of someone doing whatever it takes because the system already expects him to succeed? After that, things move even faster. Perseus is given everything he needs to make sure this mission goes smoothly. A mirrored shield from Athena, so he never has to look at Medusa directly. A sharp blade from Hermes, capable of killing her in one strike. Winged sandals to fly. A magical bag to safely carry her head. Even a helmet that grants invisibility in some versions of the myth. Just stop and think about that for a second. This isn't preparation. This is over-preparation. Every possible risk is removed before Perseus even gets close to Medusa. And here comes the second shocking truth. Perseus is turned into the perfect weapon, not because he's the strongest, But because everything around him is designed to guarantee success, and yet no one in the story questions this imbalance. No one asks whether Medusa deserves a chance. No one considers that she's facing an opponent who has been carefully equipped by the gods themselves. Instead, the narrative keeps pushing forward, building this image of Perseus as a rising hero. But underneath that image is something much more controlled. Because when you give one side every possible advantage, the outcome isn't impressive, it's inevitable. And that leads to a really uncomfortable thought. If the outcome was already decided, then was this ever about heroism at all? Or was it about carrying out a task that the gods and the people in power wanted completed? By the time Perseus finally gets close to Medusa's lair, everything is already in place. The plan is clear. The tools are ready. The risk is minimal. And Medusa? She's exactly where she's always been. No preparation. No warning. No idea that someone is coming for her. And this is where the tension really builds, because you can feel what's about to happen. And you know it's not going to be a fair confrontation. It's going to be quick, one-sided, final, and here's the third shocking truth, the one that changes how you see everything that comes next. This isn't the moment a hero proves himself. This is the moment a system completes what it started. Because long before Perseus ever stepped into that cave, the story had already decided who would win and who would be remembered as the monster. Now we're at the moment everything has been building toward the part of the story people usually imagine as intense, dramatic, maybe even heroic. Perseus finally reaches the place where Medusa lives. And in most retellings, this is where the music would rise, the tension would spike, and you'd expect some kind of epic confrontation. But if you slow it down, really picture it, the reality feels very different. There's no army, no crowd, no witnesses, just silence. A cave filled with stone figures, people who once lived, now frozen in the exact moment they saw something they weren't supposed to. And instead of charging in like a fearless warrior, Perseus does something that immediately tells you this isn't a fair fight. He avoids looking at her entirely. From the very beginning, the battle is designed to remove the most important part of any confrontation: eye contact, connection, risk. Think about that for a second. Most stories about heroes are built on facing danger directly standing your ground, looking the threat in the eye and overcoming it. But Perseus does the opposite. He looks away. He uses the reflective shield given by Athena to see Medusa indirectly, turning the entire encounter into something distant and controlled. And here's the first shocking truth for this chapter. The defining moment of Perseus's heroism is built on not facing his enemy at all. He never experiences the full danger of Medusa. He never risks turning to stone in the way every other victim did. He's protected, guided, and positioned in a way that makes the outcome almost certain. And once you see it like that, the idea of bravery starts to feel questionable. Now let's shift the focus for a moment, not to Perseus, but to Medusa. Because while he's moving carefully through the cave, calculating every step, she's not preparing for a fight. She's not waiting for him. In most versions of the myth, she's asleep. Let that sink in. The monster that defines this entire legend is resting, vulnerable, unaware, and this leads to the second shocking truth. Medusa doesn't even know she's about to be attacked. There's no warning, no chance to defend herself, no moment where she realizes what's happening and reacts. The story we've been told as a heroic victory is actually a silent approach toward someone who has no idea their life is about to end, and then comes the moment itself, the one that history remembers. Perseus, guided by reflection, steps closer. He raises his weapon, the blade given to him by Hermes. Everything is still, controlled, calculated, and in a single motion, it's over. No struggle, no prolonged fight, just one strike, clean, final. And here's where it gets even more unsettling. Medusa dies without ever seeing the person who kills her. There's something deeply disturbing about that when you really think about it. Not just because of how quickly it happens, but because of what it represents: a complete lack of confrontation. No acknowledgement, no understanding, just an act carried out from a distance, both physically and emotionally. And yet, this is the moment that turns Perseus into a legend. This single act planned, assisted, and executed under conditions that remove nearly all risk is what earns him the title of hero. The story doesn't pause to question it. It doesn't linger on Medusa's past, or what she once was, or whether she deserved any of this. It simply moves forward, as if the outcome was always meant to be this way. And maybe that's the third shocking truth. The story never asks you to feel anything for Medusa, because if it did, the idea of Perseus as a hero would start to fall apart. So instead, it keeps things simple. Monster defeated. Hero rises. End of scene. But as we keep going, you'll start to see that this moment isn't really the end of anything. It's the beginning of a much darker pattern, one where victory doesn't necessarily mean justice, and where the line between hero and monster becomes harder to see the longer you look at it. And right after that single silent strike, something strange happens, something most retellings barely pause to acknowledge, because the story doesn't slow down to process what just happened. It doesn't ask whether it was fair or necessary or even right. Instead, it immediately turns the moment into something useful. Perseus doesn't bury Medusa, doesn't reflect, doesn't hesitate. He takes her head carefully, intentionally, because from the very beginning, that was the goal. Not just to stop her, but to own a part of her. And here's the first shocking truth for this part. Medusa's death isn't treated as an ending. It's treated as the creation of a weapon. The very thing that made her feared, her gaze, is now something Perseus can carry, control, and use whenever he wants. Just think about how unsettling that is. The curse that defined her existence becomes his greatest advantage, and it doesn't stop there. As Perseus leaves the cave, the story keeps moving, almost as if it's eager to show what he can do with this new power. He doesn't question it. He doesn't struggle with it. He uses it. When he encounters enemies, he reveals Medusa's head, and instantly they turn to stone. No fight, no effort, no risk. It works every time. And here's the second shocking truth. The same power that made Medusa a monster is now celebrated when it's in the hands of a hero. Nobody calls it cruel. Nobody says it's terrifying. Instead, it's described as clever, strategic, even impressive. And that contrast is hard to ignore, because nothing about the power has changed, only who's using it. Now, if you follow the story a little further, you'll notice something even more interesting. Perseus starts shaping the world around him using that power. One of the most famous moments is when he encounters Atlas the Titan, who refuses to help him. Perseus doesn't argue. He doesn't negotiate. He simply shows him Medusa's head, and Atlas turns into stone, a mountain, according to some versions. And just like that, another life, another being is ended instantly. No hesitation, no second thought. And here comes the third shocking truth. Once Perseus gains this power, he uses it to control situations, not just to survive, but to dominate. The line between defense and aggression starts to blur, and the story doesn't stop to question where that line is anymore. And maybe this is where the narrative becomes the most uncomfortable. Because at this point, Perseus is no longer just a survivor or a reluctant hero. He's someone who carries the ability to end lives instantly, without resistance. And the story continues to reward him for it. People don't fear him the way they feared Medusa. They admire him, they celebrate him. But if you strip away the labels for a second and just look at the actions, the difference becomes harder to define. Both Medusa and Perseus can turn people to stone. Both are feared for that ability, but only one is remembered as a monster, and that leads to a question that the story never directly asks, but you can't ignore once you see it. Is the difference really about what they do, or about how the story chooses to describe them? Because by now you can start to feel the shift. This isn't just a story about killing a monster anymore. It's about what happens after. It's about power, who gets it, how they use it, and how others react to it. Medusa had power she never asked for, and she was isolated, feared, and ultimately destroyed for it. Perseus gains that same power, and suddenly he's respected, elevated, turned into a legend. And maybe that's the most disturbing realization of all. The story doesn't just tell us who the hero is. It teaches us who we're supposed to sympathize with. And once that decision is made, everything else, every action, every consequence gets interpreted through that lens. But as we keep going, you'll start to see that even that lens isn't as clear as it seems. And the closer Perseus gets to the end of his journey, the harder it becomes to ignore what he's really become. After leaving Medusa's cave, you'd think the story might finally slow down. Maybe give us a moment to process what just happened. A hero has supposedly completed the impossible. The monster is dead. The quest is over. Roll credits, right? But Greek mythology rarely works that way. Instead, the story immediately throws Perseus into another situation, one that, on the surface, looks much more traditionally heroic. On his journey home, Perseus comes across a woman chained to a rock by the sea. This woman is Andromeda, and visually, this part of the myth is dramatic enough to feel like something straight out of a movie. Crashing waves, a helpless princess, a sea monster approaching from the distance. Finally, the story seemed ready to give Perseus the kind of heroic moment people can easily root for. But if we look a little closer, as we've been doing this entire time, even this moment isn't quite as simple as it first appears. So why is Andromeda chained to a rock in the first place? Not because of anything she did. Not even close. Her mother, Queen Cassiopeia, bragged that Andromeda was more beautiful than the sea nymphs, offending powerful beings connected to the sea. Naturally, in Greek mythology, Offended gods don't just get annoyed, they overreact catastrophically. The punishment? A sea monster is sent to terrorize the kingdom, and apparently the solution is sacrifice Andromeda. Just let that logic sit with you for a moment. A mother boasts. A kingdom suffers. A daughter gets chained up as payment. And here's your first shocking truth of this chapter. Once again, a woman is punished for circumstances she didn't create. If that sounds familiar, it should, because we've already seen this pattern with Medusa. Different story, same structure. Someone powerful causes the problem. Someone vulnerable pays the price. Now this is where Perseus enters the scene like a classic hero. He sees Andromeda, is struck by her beauty, and offers to save her, but there's a condition. In many versions of the myth, he asks for her hand in marriage first. Yes, before saving her, which is a little less romantic when you phrase it plainly, isn't it? Imagine being chained to a rock, a sea monster approaching, and the person who can save you essentially says, "Sure, but what do I get in return?" That's not exactly the selfless heroism people usually imagine. And here comes the second shocking truth. Perseus's rescue of Andromeda is often presented as noble, but it's also transactional. He doesn't just save her and move on. There's an exchange built into the moment. Of course, Perseus does save her. Depending on the version, he either fights the sea monster directly or surprise. Surprise uses Medusa's head to turn it into stone. And if it's the second version, then we're back to the same pattern again. Another obstacle solved instantly through the power taken from Medusa. Another victory made possible by the remains of the very being whose death launched this whole legend. And honestly, the symbolism here is almost impossible to ignore. Even after death, Medusa is still being used. Her story doesn't end with her own fate. It continues fueling someone else's success. And here's the third shocking truth. Medusa contributes more to Perseus's victories after her death than she ever did while alive. Her power becomes his shortcut, his insurance policy, his guaranteed win button. And just like that, Perseus gains something else on top of fame and survival. A princess, a kingdom connection, and even more status. The legend grows. The image of the flawless hero becomes stronger. But if you've been paying attention, you can probably feel what's happening underneath it all. Every new victory adds another layer to Perseus's myth, making it harder and harder for anyone to question him. That's how legends work, after all. The more success someone accumulates, the less people examine how they got there. And maybe that's what makes this story so fascinating. Not just the monsters or gods or impossible quests, but how easily repeated success can rewrite morality. Because by now, Perseus isn't just surviving anymore. He's building a reputation so powerful that almost nobody stops to ask the uncomfortable question. If so many of his victories rely on borrowed power, strategic advantage, and transactional choices, what exactly are we admiring? Now, at this point in the story, Perseus has basically become unstoppable. Think about it. He survived an impossible mission, killed Medusa, rescued Andromeda, and now carries one of the deadliest objects in all of Greek mythology. From the outside, this looks like the peak of a heroic journey, the kind of story kingdoms would celebrate for generations. But this is exactly where things get dangerous, not just for the people around Perseus, but for the story itself. Because once someone becomes legendary, people stop questioning them. And when that happens, power starts changing shape. It stops being about survival and starts becoming authority. The ability to decide outcomes instantly. The ability to end conflicts before they even begin. And honestly, that's where Perseus starts feeling less like a wandering hero and more like someone carrying the power of a god. When Perseus finally returns home, he discovers something that makes everything personal again. King Polydex, the same man who manipulated him into this mission in the first place, has been abusing his power, trying to force Danae into marriage while Perseus was gone. And suddenly, after everything we've talked about, you almost want this moment to feel satisfying. You want Perseus to confront the man responsible for ruining his life. And to be fair, this is one of the few moments where his anger feels understandable. But the way he handles it is what matters. Perseus enters the palace, reveals Medusa's head, and Polydex, along with his entire court, is instantly turned to stone. No trial, no mercy, no conversation, just immediate destruction. And here's your first shocking truth for this chapter. Perseus doesn't defeat his enemies anymore, he erases them. Now, you could argue Polydex deserved it. Honestly, many people watching this story probably feel he did. But that's what makes this moment so interesting morally, because once you believe someone deserves punishment, it becomes very easy to justify extreme power. And Greek mythology loves exploring that blurry line. Perseus doesn't need to negotiate, persuade, or even fight anymore. The existence of Medusa's head changes every interaction around him. Every conflict becomes one-sided. And here comes the second shocking truth. The more power Perseus gains, the less human his actions start to feel. He no longer struggles the way ordinary people do. He simply decides an outcome, and it happens instantly. And maybe that's why the story keeps rewarding him. Because from the perspective of the myth, efficiency looks heroic. Problems appear, Perseus removes them. Threats emerge, Perseus destroys them. The world around him becomes simpler and simpler because he has the power to force simplicity onto it. But if you really stop and think about it, there's something unsettling hidden underneath that kind of heroism. Because real morality is messy. Real justice takes thought. Real people are complicated. Yet Medusa's head reduces everything to absolutes. Enemy or ally, live or stone, there's no room for understanding anymore. And the craziest part? The story treats this as triumph, not tragedy. But then something happens that Greek mythology is famous for. Fate circles back around. Remember the prophecy from the beginning, the one saying Perseus would one day kill his grandfather Acrisius? The very prophecy that caused all this fear in the first place? Well, despite every attempt to avoid it, it still comes true. During a public athletic event, Perseus throws a discus, and through pure accident or fate, it strikes Acrisius and kills him. Just like that, no evil plan, no revenge, no intentional murder. And here's the third shocking truth. The prophecy becomes true not because Perseus is evil, but because fate in Greek mythology is almost impossible to escape. Everything Acrisius did to prevent it locking away Danae, throwing Perseus into the sea, trying to control destiny, only pushed the story closer to the exact ending he feared. And honestly, That might be the darkest idea in this entire myth. Not the monsters, not the violence, not even Medusa's death, but the idea that every person in this story is trapped inside forces bigger than themselves. Acrisius becomes cruel because of fear. Danae suffers because of power. Medusa becomes a monster because of punishment. Perseus becomes a hero because the world keeps placing weapons in his hands. And all of them move toward outcomes that feel almost inevitable. That's what makes Greek mythology so haunting when you really look at it, not because it's about gods and monsters, but because underneath all the fantasy, it's really about human beings trying desperately to control things they never truly can. By now, the story of Perseus has transformed completely. What started as the tale of a young man sent on an impossible mission has turned into the rise of a legend. Kingdoms know his name. People celebrate him. He has survived monsters, outsmarted death, rescued a princess, defeated kings, and fulfilled a prophecy that was supposed to be impossible to escape. From the outside, it looks like the perfect heroic arc, the kind of myth societies love, repeating for centuries because it feels satisfying, clean, victorious. But the deeper you look into Perseus's story, the stranger it becomes. Because unlike many heroes, Perseus rarely wins through raw strength alone. He wins through gifts, guidance, advantages, and powers given to him by others. And that raises a question that almost nobody asks. How much of Perseus's legend actually belongs to Perseus? Because when every major victory depends on divine intervention, magical tools, or Medusa's power, the line between great hero and chosen instrument starts getting blurry. And honestly, Greek mythology does this on purpose. The gods are constantly shaping human lives, moving people around like pieces on a board. Athena helps Perseus. Hermes equips him. Zeus is literally his father. At almost every important moment, someone more powerful is pushing the story forward behind the scenes. And here's the first shocking truth for this chapter. Perseus may be one of the most controlled heroes in Greek mythology. His path feels less like freedom and more like destiny being carefully managed by forces beyond him. Even the moments that seem personal, like killing Medusa or saving Andromeda, happen within a system already built around him. But here's where it gets really interesting. Despite all this divine support, Perseus himself doesn't come across as arrogant in most versions of the myth. He's not like some later Greek heroes who are consumed by ego and pride. In fact, Perseus often feels surprisingly passive, almost like someone moving through events rather than fully controlling them. And maybe that's why people sympathize with him so easily. He survives terrible situations. He protects his mother. He follows the role given to him. But at the same time, that passiveness creates a strange moral tension. Because if someone keeps doing harmful things under the direction of others, at what point do they become responsible for those actions themselves? That's the uncomfortable space Perseus lives in. And here comes the second shocking truth. A person can be both a victim and a weapon at the same time. Think about it. Perseus begins life as a child, nearly murdered because of fear. He grows up under manipulation. He's pushed into dangerous situations by powerful people. But eventually, he gains enormous power himself, and once he has it, the story rarely shows him questioning how he uses it. Medusa's head becomes the perfect example. The moment he gains access to that power, it starts solving almost every problem around him. Enemies become statues. Obstacles disappear instantly. Fear works in his favor now. And what makes this fascinating is how quickly society changes its reaction depending on who holds the power. When Medusa had it, she was isolated and hunted. When Perseus uses it, he becomes legendary. Same ability, completely different judgment. And maybe that's the third shocking truth. People are often less afraid of dangerous power than they are of powerless people who possess it. The more you sit with this story, the harder it becomes to separate heroism from narrative framing. Because myths don't just tell us what happened, they tell us how to feel about what happened. They guide sympathy. They decide who gets complexity and who gets reduced to a label. Perseus gets context, motivation, legacy. Medusa gets called a monster. Polydex gets called a tyrant. Andromeda becomes the rescued princess. Everyone is placed into a role the story wants us to accept. But once you start pulling those roles apart, the myth changes shape entirely. Suddenly, Perseus isn't just the hero. He's a young man shaped by fear, prophecy, divine influence, and violence moving through a world where power constantly decides morality. And honestly, that version of the story is far more interesting than the simple one we were told as children. At this point, you can probably feel something changing in the story. Not just in the events themselves, but in the way we see them. Because the longer we follow Perseus, the harder it becomes to view him as just a simple hero from an old legend. He starts feeling more human than that more complicated. And honestly, that's what makes Greek mythology survive for thousands of years. These stories aren't remembered because people love monsters and swords. They're remembered because underneath all the fantasy, they reflect uncomfortable truths about power, fear, and the way societies decide who deserves sympathy. And Perseus's story might be one of the best examples of that. Because depending on how you tell it, he can either look like a brave savior or someone who inherited violence and kept passing it forward. One of the strangest things about Perseus is how little emotional weight the myth gives to Medusa after her death. Think about that carefully. Medusa is one of the most recognizable figures in all of mythology. Her face is everywhere, movies, statues, paintings, books. But in the original flow of the myth, once she dies, the story mostly stops caring about her as a person. She becomes an object, a weapon, a symbol. Perseus carries her head around like a tool, and the world simply accepts it. No one asks whether she deserved compassion. No one mourns her. And here's the first shocking truth for this chapter. Medusa becomes more useful to the world dead than alive. That's dark when you really think about it. The story values her power, but not her humanity. And maybe that's why modern audiences are so drawn to reinterpreting her story. Because today, people look back at Medusa and see something ancient audiences may not have focused on as much. Tragedy. A woman transformed against her will, punished after being wronged, feared for something she didn't choose. And suddenly, Perseus's role starts looking very different too. Not necessarily evil, but deeply tied to a system that never gave Medusa a chance to be seen as human again. And this creates one of the most fascinating reversals in mythology. Over time, Medusa slowly transformed from villain into victim in the eyes of many people. Meanwhile, Perseus, once the unquestioned hero, became morally debatable. And here comes the second shocking truth. The meaning of a myth changes depending on the values of the people retelling it. That idea alone completely changes how you experience this story. Because myths aren't frozen in time. They evolve with us. Ancient audiences may have admired Perseus without hesitation because defeating monsters symbolized order, defeating chaos. But modern audiences tend to ask different questions. Was the monster born evil? Did power influence the story? Was the punishment fair? And honestly, those questions make the myth far more interesting, because suddenly there isn't a clean answer anymore. Perseus isn't purely heroic. Medusa isn't purely monstrous. Even Athena becomes morally complicated. Was she protecting her temple? Punishing Medusa unfairly? Acting out of pride? Every character becomes layered the moment you stop accepting the myth at surface level. And maybe that's the real reason this story still survives after thousands of years. Not because of the action or the monsters, but because it forces us to confront how easily narratives shape morality. The hero is often the one whose story gets repeated the loudest. The monster is often the one who loses the chance to explain themselves. And Perseus's legend sits right in the middle of that uncomfortable truth. Because if you strip away the titles, the glory, and the dramatic artwork, what remains is a deeply human story about fear, survival, manipulation, and power. A young man used by kings and gods. A woman transformed into something terrifying against her will. A society that chooses who deserves empathy. And the most unsettling part of all, even now, thousands of years later, people are still arguing over who the real monster was. Now here's where the story becomes less about mythology and more about memory, because something strange happens after legends survive for thousands of years. People stop separating the characters from the symbols they represent. And that absolutely happened with Medusa. Over time, Medusa stopped being just a figure in an old Greek story and became something much bigger, an image people used everywhere. Her face appeared on shields, temples, armor, doorways, mosaics, statues. Ancient Greeks even believed her image could protect people from evil, which is honestly ironic when you think about it. The same woman feared as a monster became a symbol used for protection. And here's the first shocking truth for this chapter. The Greeks were terrified of Medusa's power, but they also wanted that power close to them. They feared her, yet painted her onto weapons. They called her monstrous, yet used her face to guard sacred places. It's almost like society didn't hate Medusa as much as it hated not controlling what she represented. And if that sounds familiar, it's because humans still do this today. We often fear powerful things until we figure out how to use them ourselves. And that's exactly what happened in Perseus' story too. Once Perseus possessed Medusa's head, her power suddenly became acceptable, useful, heroic even. But Medusa herself never received that acceptance while she was alive. That contradiction sits at the center of the myth, and honestly, it's probably why modern audiences keep returning to it. Because the story accidentally reveals something deeply human. People are often more comfortable turning someone into a symbol than understanding them as a person. Medusa becomes easier to accept once she's reduced to an object, a warning or a weapon. The complexity disappears. And here comes the second shocking truth. Societies often erase the humanity of people they fear before they destroy them. Now let's talk about Athena for a moment, because the older you get, the harder her role in this myth becomes to ignore. Athena is supposed to represent wisdom, strategy, justice, civilization. She's one of the most respected gods in Greek mythology. Yet in Medusa's story, her actions feel unsettling. Instead of punishing Poseidon, the god who violated her temple, Athena punishes Medusa. And even after transforming her into a monster, Athena later helps Perseus kill her. Just think about how brutal that sequence is. Medusa loses her humanity, becomes isolated from the world, and then the very goddess connected to her downfall assists in ending her life. And honestly, this is one of the reasons modern interpretations often struggle with Athena's role, because the myth forces us to confront a difficult reality. Wisdom and morality are not always the same thing, but Greek mythology never really cared about perfect morality in the modern sense. The gods aren't role models. They're powerful beings with emotions, pride, jealousy, and agendas. And maybe that's what makes these myths feel strangely real despite all the fantasy. The gods behave like exaggerated humans. Athena protects her temple, her pride, and her authority. Poseidon acts without consequence because power shields him. Perseus follows the path set before him because survival and glory pull him forward. Nobody is completely innocent. Nobody is completely evil. And that complexity is what keeps the story alive. Because if Medusa were simply born a monster, this myth would have been forgotten centuries ago. It's the tragedy underneath the horror that people remember. And maybe that's why Medusa's image has changed so dramatically over time. Ancient art often portrayed her as terrifying wild eyes, sharp teeth, snakes everywhere. But modern depictions? They often make her beautiful, sorrowful, almost hauntingly human. That shift says a lot about us. It shows how every generation reshapes myths according to what it fears most. Ancient societies feared chaos and disorder, so Medusa became a terrifying warning. Modern audiences fear injustice, abuse of power, and the silencing of victims, so Medusa becomes tragic instead. And here's the third shocking truth. The real power of mythology isn't that it tells us about the past. It reveals what each generation believes about itself. That's why this story still feels alive today. Not because people are obsessed with monsters, but because deep down, we're still trying to decide who deserved our sympathy all along. And the more you think about it, the stranger the entire story becomes. Because if Medusa was truly nothing more than a mindless monster, then why has the world spent thousands of years trying to reinterpret her? Why do artists keep repainting her? Why do writers keep retelling her story from different angles? Why are people still arguing about her even now? Monsters in mythology usually stay simple. They exist to be defeated, and that's it. But Medusa refuses to stay simple. Every generation keeps pulling her story back apart, almost like people instinctively feel there's something unfinished about it. And honestly, maybe that's because deep down, the myth never fully resolves the emotional tension it creates. It gives us a heroic ending, but leaves behind questions that never disappear. Questions about punishment, about power, about whether fear can transform someone into the very thing society accuses them of being. And here's the first shocking truth for this chapter. Medusa became more powerful as a symbol after her death than she ever was while alive. Now compare that to Perseus for a second. Perseus wins. He survives. He becomes legendary. But strangely, modern audiences rarely connect emotionally with him the way they do with Medusa. Isn't that interesting? The hero of the story often feels emotionally distant, while the supposed monster feels painfully human. And maybe that's because Perseus represents something people are less comfortable romanticizing today: unquestioned victory. Ancient myths loved heroes who conquered threats and restored order. Modern audiences tend to be more suspicious of systems that define certain people as threats in the first place. That shift completely changes how the myth feels. Suddenly, Perseus isn't just brave, he's part of a larger structure of power involving kings, gods, expectations, and violence. Meanwhile, Medusa becomes the isolated figure trapped underneath that structure. And honestly, one of the darkest parts of this entire myth is how loneliness surrounds Medusa's story. Think about it carefully. After her transformation, she's removed from society completely, hidden away, feared by everyone. No allies, no voice, no one trying to understand her. Her existence becomes defined entirely by what other people say she is. And here comes the second shocking truth. Medusa never gets the chance to tell her own story. Everything we know about her comes through the perspective of others' heroes, poets, gods, storytellers. That matters, because whoever controls the narrative usually controls public sympathy too. Perseus gets songs, glory, statues. Medusa gets silence, except for the terrifying image people project into her. And maybe that's why her story feels so modern despite being ancient. Because even now, societies still reduce people into labels before fully understanding them. Hero, villain, victim, monster. Once those labels stick, they become incredibly difficult to escape. Medusa's transformation into a literal monster almost feels symbolic of that process. The world decides what she is, and eventually that identity consumes everything else about her. But the myth accidentally leaves traces of her humanity behind, just enough to make people uncomfortable, just enough to keep audiences questioning the story centuries later. And that's what makes this myth so powerful compared to simpler legends. It doesn't fully close the moral wound it opens. By the end of Perseus's journey, the official version of the story is clear. The hero wins, the monster dies, order is restored. But emotionally, it doesn't feel that simple anymore. Because once you've looked closely at everything, the manipulation, the punishment, the imbalance of power, the isolation, it becomes almost impossible to return to the clean childhood version of the myth. And maybe that's the third shocking truth. The older and more thoughtful people become, the less satisfying simple, good versus evil stories start to feel. We begin noticing the people left out of the narrative, the voices ignored, the pain hidden underneath the triumph. And suddenly the question at the center of this myth changes completely. It's no longer, did Perseus defeat Medusa? We already know he did. The real question becomes something far more uncomfortable. What kind of world creates monsters in the first place? And why are we so eager to believe the story told by the people who survived them? At this point, the story of Perseus and Medusa stops feeling like a myth you simply listen to and starts feeling like a mirror. Because once you strip away the gods, monsters, and magic, what's left underneath is something surprisingly familiar: fear, reputation, power. The way society decides who deserves empathy and who doesn't. And honestly, one of the most unsettling things about this myth is realizing how easily people accepted Medusa's role as a monster without ever needing to hear her side. Think about that. Entire generations repeated this story with complete confidence. Perseus good, Medusa evil, simple, comfortable. But the moment you start asking even a few questions, the entire structure shakes. Suddenly you realize most people in the story never cared about understanding Medusa. They only cared about surviving her, controlling her, or using her image for their own purposes. And here's the first shocking truth for this chapter. Sometimes society creates monsters by refusing to see wounded people as human beings anymore. Now, to be fair, Medusa was dangerous. We can't ignore that part. Her gaze literally turned people to stone. Anyone who looked directly at her died. That fear was real. But Greek mythology constantly asks us to think about where danger comes from. Was Medusa born violent? No. Was she raised to destroy people? No. According to later versions of the myth, she became what she was because of punishment, trauma, and isolation. And that changes the emotional weight of everything. Because there's a huge difference between someone choosing evil and someone being transformed by suffering until the world only sees them as frightening. And honestly, that's part of what makes her story so tragic. The more monstrous she became outwardly, the less anyone cared about who she used to be inwardly. Meanwhile, Perseus's reputation keeps growing cleaner and brighter with every retelling. Statues are made of him. Stories celebrate him. He becomes one of Greece's great heroes. But what's fascinating is how little attention ancient storytellers gave to the emotional consequences of what he did. There's almost no reflection, no guilt, no moment where Perseus questions whether Medusa deserved death. The story simply moves forward because myths often care more about symbolic victory than emotional complexity. And here comes the second shocking truth. Heroes in ancient mythology were often judged by success, not morality. If you won, protected society, or fulfilled destiny, your methods became secondary. Modern audiences struggle with that idea because we tend to value intention and ethics much more heavily. But ancient myths existed in a world where survival, order, and power were often considered more important than fairness. And maybe that's why modern retellings keep changing the emotional center of the story. These days, people often feel more haunted by Medusa than inspired by Perseus. Artists paint her with sadness instead of rage. Writers portray her as lonely instead of evil. Even in movies and games, there's often this feeling that something tragic exists beneath the horror. And honestly, that shift says just as much about us as it does about the myth itself. We live in a time where people are more sensitive to injustice, manipulation, and abuse of power. So naturally, audiences look back at Medusa and think, wait, why was she punished? Meanwhile, Perseus starts being examined more critically, not because he's pure evil, But because people are questioning the systems around him, the kings, the gods, the narrative itself. But here's the thing that makes this myth truly timeless. Both interpretations can exist at once. Perseus can still be brave. Medusa can still be tragic. The story doesn't actually force us to choose one side completely. Instead, it leaves us in an uncomfortable space where multiple truths exist together. Perseus really did face terrifying danger. Medusa really was feared. But Medusa was also deeply wronged. And Perseus was also shaped by manipulation and divine influence. Nobody escapes untouched. And maybe that's the third shocking truth. The most powerful myths survive because they refuse to stay morally simple. They evolve with every generation because human beings keep finding new fears, new questions, and new meanings hidden inside them. That's why we're still talking about this story thousands of years later, not because it's about a monster being killed, but because it forces us to confront how easily humans divide the world into heroes and monsters, even when reality is far more complicated. And maybe the strangest part of all this is realizing how differently the story feels depending on whose eyes you look through. If you experience the myth through Perseus, it becomes a story about survival, impossible odds, destiny, and courage. A young man thrown into danger by powerful people, forced to complete a mission that should have killed him. From that perspective, Perseus absolutely looks heroic. He survives what no one else could. He protects his mother. He defeats terrifying enemies. He overcomes fate itself, or at least learns to live within it. But if you experience the same story through Medusa, everything changes. Suddenly it becomes a story about losing control of your own life, about being punished after suffering, about becoming feared for something forced upon you. And honestly, that's what makes this myth so emotionally powerful compared to simpler legends. It doesn't just ask, who won? It quietly asks something much harder. Who was allowed to remain human in the eyes of the world? Because that's really what happened to Medusa, isn't it? Long before Perseus arrived, society had already stopped seeing her as a person. She became a warning, a curse, a creature hidden away at the edge of the world. And once someone is reduced to a symbol of fear, people stop asking what created them in the first place. That happens constantly throughout history, even outside mythology. Societies often label certain people as dangerous, monstrous, or broken, while ignoring the systems, trauma, or power structures that shaped them. And here's the first shocking truth for this chapter. People are often more comfortable destroying monsters than understanding them. Understanding requires empathy. It requires complexity. Destruction is easier, simpler, cleaner. Now here's where Perseus's role becomes really fascinating morally, because despite everything, he never comes across as cruel for the sake of cruelty. That's important. Perseus isn't portrayed as someone who enjoys suffering. In many ways, he's just moving through the path the world laid out for him. Kings manipulate him. Gods equip him. Prophecies shape him. Expectations follow him everywhere. And maybe that's what makes him tragic too, in a completely different way. Perseus spends his life becoming whatever everyone else needs him to be: a weapon, a hero, a symbol of victory. But very rarely do we see him simply existing as himself. And here comes the second shocking truth. Heroes in mythology often lose their humanity in a different way than monsters do. Monsters are stripped of sympathy. Heroes are stripped of vulnerability. Both become symbols instead of people, and when you think about it like that, the entire myth starts feeling almost sad from every angle. Medusa loses her identity and becomes feared by the world. Perseus loses his ordinary humanity and becomes trapped inside legend. Even the ending reflects this strange emptiness. Perseus eventually gives Medusa's head to Athena, who places it onto her shield, the Aegis. And there's something haunting about that image. Medusa, the woman turned monster, then turned weapon, finally becomes permanent decoration on the armor of a goddess. Her face survives forever, but not her voice, her thoughts, or her version of events. Just the symbol people chose to preserve. And maybe that's why this myth still feels alive after thousands of years. Because deep down, it's not really about ancient Greece anymore. It's about us. About the way humans tell stories. About how power shapes reputation. About how fear changes perception. About how easy it is to turn people into symbols instead of understanding them fully. And maybe the final shocking truth hidden inside this myth is this. The line between hero and monster is often decided less by actions and more by who controls the story afterward. Perseus survived, so history celebrated him. Medusa lost, so history feared her. But once you start looking beneath those labels, the story becomes far more unsettling and far more human than the simple legend most of us grew up hearing. By now, you've probably realized something important about this story. It was never really just about a hero killing a monster. That's the simplified version the version myths often become after centuries of retelling. But underneath all of that, the story of Perseus and Medusa is really about perspective, about who gets remembered with sympathy and who gets remembered with fear. And honestly, once you notice that, it becomes impossible to unsee it, because almost every major character in this myth is trapped inside a role created by forces larger than themselves. Perseus is shaped by prophecy before he's even born. Medusa is transformed because of divine punishment. Danae suffers because powerful men fear losing control. Even kings and gods are constantly reacting to fate, pride, or insecurity. Nobody in this story is truly free. And here's the first shocking truth for this final chapter. Greek mythology often isn't about good people defeating evil. It's about damaged people trying to survive systems of power far beyond them. And maybe that's why these stories still hit so hard today. Because despite all the fantasy elements, snakes for hair, magical shields, gods descending from the sky, the emotions underneath feel painfully human. Fear of losing control. Fear of being judged. Fear of becoming something the world no longer understands. Medusa represents one kind of tragedy, a person reduced to the worst thing that ever happened to them. Perseus represents another, a person praised so heavily for surviving that nobody stops to question the cost of what they became along the way. And honestly, that duality is what makes this myth so brilliant. It refuses to stay emotionally comfortable. The closer you look, the more everyone starts feeling both sympathetic and dangerous at the same time. What's especially fascinating is how differently modern audiences respond to this myth compared to ancient audiences. Ancient Greece admired strength, order, victory, and divine favor. Perseus fit perfectly into that worldview. He defeated chaos. He completed impossible tasks. He fulfilled destiny. But modern audiences tend to focus more on trauma, injustice, and moral ambiguity. That shift changes everything. Suddenly, Medusa isn't just terrifying, she's tragic. Athena isn't just wise, she's morally complicated. Perseus isn't just heroic, he's part of a system that benefits from violence already, decided by more powerful forces. And here comes the second shocking truth. Every generation rewrites mythology according to what it fears most about itself. That's why Medusa has become such a powerful symbol in modern culture. Not because people suddenly think turning others to stone is acceptable, but because they recognize the emotional truth underneath her: transformation, isolation, rage, pain, being defined by a single moment forever. Meanwhile, Perseus becomes harder to interpret cleanly because modern audiences are naturally suspicious of stories where the official hero is supported by overwhelming power structures. Kings support him. Gods support him. Destiny supports him. And the supposed monster? She stands completely alone. Once you notice that imbalance, the emotional center of the story shifts permanently. You stop asking, how did Perseus defeat Medusa? And start asking, why did the world need Medusa to remain a monster in the first place? And maybe that's the reason this myth survived while so many others faded away. It leaves behind tension that never fully resolves. Even now, thousands of years later, people still debate who deserves sympathy. People still reinterpret the ending. People still look at Medusa's face and feel something deeper than fear. That's the mark of a truly powerful story, not that it gives simple answers, but that it forces every generation to wrestle with uncomfortable questions all over again. Because in the end, the myth of Perseus and Medusa isn't really asking us to choose between hero and monster. It's asking us something much harder. How many of the monsters in history were once human beings whose stories were never fully heard? And maybe that's the perfect place to end this story, right at the moment where certainty disappears. Because if there's one thing Greek mythology understood better than most modern stories, it's that human beings are complicated. People want clean endings. They want obvious heroes, obvious villains, obvious justice. But myths like this survive precisely because they refuse to stay simple. Perseus really was brave. He really did survive impossible situations. He really did protect the people he loved. But Medusa was also deeply tragic. She was feared, isolated, transformed, and remembered almost entirely through the perspective of the people who destroyed her. Those truths exist together, and the moment you accept that, the story becomes far more unsettling than the version most of us heard as children. And honestly, maybe that discomfort is the point, because stories about monsters have always revealed more about society than about the monsters themselves. Think about it. Every era creates creatures that reflect its fears. Ancient Greece feared chaos, disorder, and the loss of control, so Medusa became the perfect symbol, a woman whose very gaze could destroy structure and certainty. But modern audiences often fear something different: abuse of power, injustice, manipulation. and the way systems can strip away someone's humanity. So now people look at Medusa and see loneliness instead of pure evil, pain instead of pure horror. And here's the final shocking truth of this story. Sometimes the scariest part of a monster isn't what they became. It's understanding how they got there. What makes this even more haunting is how timeless that idea really is. Because throughout history, societies have always divided people into categories that feel emotionally convenient: hero, villain, outsider, threat. Once someone is placed into one of those roles, the world often stops asking deeper questions. And that's exactly what happened in this myth. Perseus was rewarded because his victories benefited the world around him. Medusa was condemned because her existence frightened it. But fear has a way of simplifying people until all nuance disappears. The same story repeats over and over again across history, not just in myths, but in real life too. And maybe that's why this ancient legend still feels so strangely modern. Deep down, it's not just about gods and monsters. It's about the terrifying power of narratives themselves, because whoever controls the narrative often controls morality. If the winner tells the story, the winner becomes the hero. If the defeated lose their voice, they become the monster. And once you realize that the myth changes forever, suddenly every detail feels heavier. Medusa's isolation, Perseus's divine support, Athena's punishment, the way Medusa's head continued being used long after her death. None of it feels accidental anymore. It feels like a world constantly deciding whose suffering matters and whose doesn't. That's why people still argue about this story thousands of years later. Not because they're obsessed with ancient Greece, but because the emotional conflict inside the myth never really ended. So in the end, maybe the question was never, was Perseus a hero? Or was Medusa a monster? Maybe those labels were always too small for a story this complicated. Maybe the real lesson hidden inside this myth is that human beings desperately want the world to be simple even when it isn't. We want clear sides, clear morality, clear endings. But the closer you look at history, mythology, and even people themselves, the blurrier those lines become. And perhaps that's why the story of Perseus and Medusa still survives after thousands of years. Because deep down, all of us are still trying to answer the same uncomfortable question. When the story is finally over, who gets remembered as human and who gets remembered as the monster? Maybe that's why the story of Perseus and Medusa still survives after thousands of years. Not because it's about gods or monsters, but because it forces us to question the stories we blindly accept. Was Perseus truly a hero? Was Medusa truly a monster? Or were they both trapped inside a world controlled by fear, power, and fate? And honestly, maybe that question matters more today than ever before. If you enjoyed this journey into Greek mythology, don't forget to subscribe, because there are many more ancient stories hiding darker truths beneath the surface. Tonight we uncovered one of them,